The date is August 7th, 1974. In New York, it's a damp, gloomy day. A light rain falls over Manhattan, and on the front page of the New York Times, Israel is in negotiations with Jordan to hand back land in the occupied West Bank. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger has been cleared of misleading a Senate committee for wiretapping officials and journalists. But truly, only one story dominates the news: Watergate. Readers don't know this, but in less than 24 hours, President Richard Nixon will resign over the scandal that led to the impeachment proceedings now hanging over his head. They fear democracy is in trouble. A U.S. president impeached? Not in this day and age. Early risers might feel some optimism when they look downtown to see a new monument of American financial might. The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, tallest buildings in the world, opened only a year ago in Lower Manhattan, and they loom over the city and the wide expanse of New York Harbor. And if you look up to the summit of the towers on this day, in between them, you will see a tiny dot. At just after 7 a.m., 100 stories up, above the waking city, is a man. His name is Philippe Petit, and he's walking on a tightrope. No harness, no support, just a pole for balance, and incredible daring.
I had to make a decision of shifting my weight from one foot anchored to the building to the foot anchored on the wire. This is probably the end of my life.
Crowds begin to gather at the base of the tower. People point to the sky.
I start walking as a wire walker who is studying his cable.
The police arrive. At halfway, Petit, no longer concerned by the precarity of his situation, takes a look.
I sit down on the wire in one of my crossing, and I did something that amazed people, actually look all the way down, to look at something that I will never in my life see again.
Sirens blare out across the city. The police tell him, "Get down, or a helicopter will pluck you off." Police, although enraged, are spellbound. Nobody can look away. That was 50 years ago. Today, in 2024, the American people en masse seem to be walking on a tightrope of another kind.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs.
It is a choice about whether we have a country rooted in freedom for every American or ruled by chaos and division.
If you believe one side, American democracy is at stake. And if you believe the other, American democracy is at stake. Never in recent history has there been an election fought so fervently by political supporters, not just in the country where it's happening, but across the globe. It almost feels like the world's election. And just like those watching Philippe Petit walk between the Twin Towers, as it all unfolds for those not from the United States, there is a feeling of helplessness. Because unless you're a registered U.S. voter, what happens next is entirely out of your control. You can watch as Donald Trump and Kamala Harris walk the tightrope of American democracy. You can wince and recoil at every scare, every slip.
Making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID. With
every misstep.
She got 85 million votes because she's just so impressive. As the first Samoan Malaysian IQ.
But you can't look away.
California prosecutor ever to be elected president.
You are listening to Leave It to the Experts. I'm Sam Hendricks. From the moment the next U.S. president is declared, the life trajectory of hundreds of millions of people will be altered. Elections are always important. American elections are no exception, and also quite exceptional. But rarely has the vote of so few people had the potential to affect so many. From Washington, D.C., across the world, the results of this will be felt in all corners in unique and potentially damaging ways. It seems like every day since the last election ended has been ramping up to this point.
This was a hate rally. I think it's very important for people to understand that these are mini January 6 rallies.
The discourse has veered out of control.
I'm a supporter of the Palestinians. I'm used to it.
Yeah, I hope your beeper doesn't go off. The thing is that
you just say I should die.
There have been multiple attempts on Donald Trump's life, and the incumbent president dropped out after all the primaries to nominate him had been run. There's endless polling.
A new CNN poll from Pennsylvania.
So here we are. This is the national race 1 week out.
An analysis point after analysis point.
And what could happen if Trump loses? We can expect legal challenges. There's concern about violence. And we know what happened last time.
All being piped to the American people's screens in increasingly distorted ways.
The social media site X is a hub for conversation about the US election, but some of the posts are fake and misleading.
The balance between free speech and saying stuff that you know is either untrue or you just say it in a very brash way to egg people on is an interesting era that we're in.
The way we process and deal with this information is itself causing new and strange outcomes. From Americans claiming that the recent hurricanes across the U.S. were caused by the government, to its own government representatives amplifying the claims.
Republican Congressman Marjorie Taylor Greene is promoting a bizarre conspiracy theory about a mysterious they, you can imagine who that is, controlling the weather.
It appears the U.S. has not entirely learned the lessons of past elections, as disinformation narratives once pointed to outside actors like Russia or China. They're now being played out by Americans themselves in an attempt to win the endless culture wars. The U.S. media has played a role of choosing engagement over substance once again. As the old world of mainstream media and the absolutists of the future created information overload for frayed and stressed communities left to fight for themselves in the war of opinion. So let's narrow in on how the fractured media landscape is influencing this election with our first guest, Bill Wyman. He's a lecturer in journalism at the University of Sydney, and he writes regularly for the Sydney Morning Herald and New York Magazine. Thanks for joining us, Bill. The first thing I wanted to talk about is just the media spectacle of this election around the world. And I'm curious if you see a big difference in the way that international media covers U.S. politics compared to the way it tends to be covered in domestic U.S. news.
Well, it's funny, actually, because it's treated with surprising seriousness and probity and a lack of the insanity in the United States. And so I've just been honestly so impressed by so much of the Australian media, particularly on the ABC, who I think do such a much better job than the typical CNN people in America, believe it or not. And it's nothing against the CNN people, but that whole process by which they ask one of their ridiculous 8 people on one of their ridiculous panels a question, and the person can say the most outlandish thing in the world, and Wolf Blitzer will go, and then move on. You know, there's the A and then there's B, but there's never the C. They always just move to the next person.
I wonder what your take is on the media's role in keeping it a close horse race and really not pushing issues that would possibly jeopardize that. And I wonder if you see a sort of media interest in keeping it a close race.
It's really, really true. And that critique I find really interesting, because that last thing you said is definitely true, that they can, for a long time, for example, CNN would just let Trump talk uninhibited at his rallies because it got people watching. And it's a capitalist society. It's like an independent company. They can do what they want. The critique of the media wanting the horse race is also really interesting. And it's definitely true to some extent, but it's so much more complicated these days, because when we talk about, quote unquote, the media, we're talking at least about 3 different things. And what I would say the traditional media, which includes CNN, National Public Radio, most newspapers, kind of all the mainstream journalism, which is referred to as the left or something like that, but just simply isn't true. It's just normal mainstream down the line journalism. If anything, it goes too easy on Republicans. Then you have the Fox News empire, which is a completely different kind of bizarre animal in the midst of all this, which is incredibly partisan, unethical, and unfair, and spreads lies and all sorts of other things. And then you have this new world of social media. So it's hard to make these blanket statements in the media. And people in the traditional mainstream media, it drives them crazy because, it's their job to sort of present both sides and be fair. My issue with it is a couple of things. One, there's this sort of memory hole thing, and they just sort of assume that people know. And so you can literally read all these stories about Donald Trump these days, and they don't mention that he has felony convictions. They don't mention that his company was found, that he was found guilty of sexual assault, that all this stuff, because they just let it go. They go, everyone knows that. And you get into this weird situation where there's so many people that if one of those things 1/10 as serious, it would be attached to the person for the rest of their career. It would just always be, the person who blah, blah, blah. And with Trump, it just gets lost. And now there's been these debates where very serious people have a chance to interview Donald Trump for 90 minutes or 2 hours, and they don't even bring up some of this stuff. They go, oh, no, what's your position on climate change, as if that's relevant. You don't get to start from ground zero anymore. Al Gore and George Bush were happy to start from ground zero and let them make their case, but we have a different case here. So that really happens. And so I think, if anything, there is the timidity on the part of the mainstream media because they're afraid of being viewed as whatever. And it's this brilliant strategy on the right. I remember when one of the founders of Fox News, Roger Ailes, died, and there was a New York Times obituary, and it said, liberals always decried, Fox News's tendency to blah, 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 blah. And that's a Fox News construction, that if you're opposed to Fox News, you're a liberal in the American sense. And the thing is, everyone hates that. Anyone who's honest, anyone who believes in ethics, that's who was opposed to what Roger Ailes did. It's not a partisan thing, but they brilliantly create this partisan divide. They say, oh, we're the fair ones. And then finally, we have to understand there's this huge section of America who don't read the New York Times, don't read the Washington Post, or look at CNN, and they get all their vague information from social media. As a journalism professor, it just drives me crazy when a student said, oh, I read it. Where'd you read it? I don't know. It was on Facebook. It was on Twitter. It was on Instagram. Well, where was it from? I don't know. And that's the sort of thing that obviously to me and you, and I think a lot of our listeners, it's nails on a blackboard to hear someone who completely not even understanding that whatever they were reading was sourced somewhere, and to not have any understanding of the source because it's completely foreign to us. So it's not a pretty situation.
I want to go back to what you were talking about traditional media, just to jump on the recent issue of the Washington Post and the LA Times and their very visible non-endorsements of Harris. There's been all this stuff about what does it matter if these papers endorse or not? What's the real story there?
Yeah, you've really put your finger on it, because it's one of those things, like the endorsements really don't matter. And traditionally, going back 50, 60 years, there was this huge thing every year, like, the papers that endorsed Kennedy over Nixon in 1960, the ones that endorsed Reagan over Mondale in 84. Some years you have huge, overwhelming things. Generally, newspaper endorsements were conservative. That started changing a little bit under Bill Clinton. And then obviously by the time of Barack Obama, after, what George Bush basically did to the Republican Party, they sort of really started becoming overwhelmingly Democratic. If the Washington Post endorsed Kamala Harris, nobody would have paid attention. It just doesn't matter. It's, the idea of a paper, which is supposed to be a serious keeper of American values and stuff like this, actually supporting Donald Trump, someone who had, overseen January 6th and was a criminal and all this other stuff, not even getting into the calamitous nature of his actual presidency, is just unthinkable. Jeff Bezos, who's the owner of the Washington Post, right? Jeff Bezos is the owner of Amazon. The worst case scenario is that Jeff Bezos and Donald Trump got on the line together and said, okay, you don't endorse Kamala Harris, then I'll give your space company some whatever if I get elected. The thing is, who really cares? And it could just be that they're both so old and so out of it that they kind of, because Trump is still living in the age where being on the cover of Time magazine means something, and Time magazine doesn't really exist anymore. So it could be that they're both living in this weird age and they think that that's a big deal. Or it could be that Jeff Bezos knew it wasn't a big deal, and so he was happy to give it away to Trump. And I don't think that happened. I'm just saying that's the worst case scenario. So, but what really happened is this thing that didn't even matter has turned into a huge imbroglio. It's that, they call the Streisand effect, that you try to not pay attention to something and it becomes 10 times worse than you could have imagined. And then the other thing, though, that I think, and again, as a journalist, you don't want to seem partisan, but we're living in a very unusual age. It just shows either that someone like Jeff Bezos is so out of touch with reality that he thinks that this doesn't matter, or that the election doesn't matter, or that he actually has personal reasons for wanting Donald Trump to be elected. And the idea that, an intelligent person who's, built this extraordinary business can look at the world right now and say, we really shouldn't take a stand is really, really bad. It's disturbing. He's worth, I think, $200 billion roughly, right? And so the quote unquote business doesn't matter, but he's been saying that the Post has been losing $75 million a year. And what I think people forget is the Washington Post, it has this famous national brand, but it's a local paper. It's the paper of Washington, D.C. and what they call the Beltway, which is that the freeway that circles that. And really what Washington, D.C. is, it's this relatively small town and basically a diamond-shaped city. And then you have Southern Maryland at the north, and then you have Eastern Virginia to the west. And those are 7 of the 9 richest counties in America, or 8 of the 12 richest counties. These are extraordinary prosperous. And you have the actual business of government. This is where all these people live. So they all know who Donald Trump is. They're people that are pretty sophisticated when it comes to such things. And so he's basically thumbing his nose at them. They're saying, and now the Washington Post is confirming, that 250,000 people have stopped their subscriptions. It's sort of a complicated thing, so I would take that a little grain of salt, but that could be as much as 10% of their audience. So this is a huge it's really exposing him as a morally dubious person, given the stakes, and it's odd. And sort of the same thing goes with this guy in Los Angeles named Sun Shing, who's this billionaire doctor who bought the Los Angeles Times. They're both to be lauded for trying to prop up these important institutions. But there's something really wrong when you say, hey, because these are places who didn't endorse him in 16 and didn't endorse him in 20. And now all of a sudden, after January 6th, after all the criminal trials, they're saying, we're not going to take a stand.
Meanwhile, along with all of what you've said about really the sort of traditional media, big broadcasters, major papers, in social media world, there's a whole other kind of discussion, way of communicating. And now you've got these celebrity endorsements, which following that whatever that was at Madison Square Garden the other night sort of brought in this whole stream of, outraged pop stars. And that's fascinating. That's, that really could potentially move people or just kind of nudge people who might not be tuned in necessarily to the day-to-day of all of this.
Yeah, I think that's true, because there has been over the years, what you're saying is totally right, because there has been this sort of eye rolling over the years. Like I remember in 2004, toward the end, Bruce Springsteen was touring with John Kerry, and I said, oh my God, that's a game changer. And so, there's a lot of lessons that isn't true. And of course you have the usual suspects, Bruce Springsteen and some other people going around, but people like Beyonce and Taylor Swift are on sort of a different level this time. And I think the nuance is what you just said, that given that some people are getting their news through social media, that's where that's going to really get them with full force, right? It's going to be mainlined into them. And, Taylor Swift is a phenomenon like hasn't been seen in a very long time, particularly when you do have the gender gap. I think that really helped a little bit. And those remarks at Madison Square Garden are really interesting because sometimes a lot of these people are very scared, I think. I think one of the reasons that Taylor Swift sort of delayed for a long time is that coming out and doing this endorsement, she's still doing big concerts. The last thing they want are bomb threats, anything that might endanger their fans. Because some of these people on the right are definitely dangerous people. And so I think a lot of people have been pretty tame. I think particularly the pop world, I think a lot of those people are obviously appalled by Trump. One of my little pet things is Jay-Z. You can search online for the last 8 years and you won't see Jay-Z, who was supposed to be this tough guy, saying much about Donald Trump. And I'm sure he gives money to Democrats, but there's a lot of people who don't step up. And the remark in Madison Square Garden which if people don't know, of course, some ridiculous comedian said, oh, there's a big floating pile of garbage in the Pacific Ocean, Atlantic Ocean. It's called Puerto Rico. And if you watch the guy, it's really one of this has been a very vulgar, awful, despicable election from the right. And I have to say, this was the worst. It was so unfounded. It came out of nowhere. It was so cruel. Puerto Rico is a very small, very poor nation in the Caribbean. And for this snotty, rich guy sitting there, Madison Square Garden, the richest city in the world, calling it a pile of garbage, it just feels beyond the pale. I mean, it was cruel and mean in a way that just really transcended everything. So there's a big, remarkable payback there. I'm not a big expert on this, but they say there's a huge Puerto Rican population in Pennsylvania, for example, which is a big swing state. And, there's also going to be a little bit of residual to all sorts of Latino things. So I actually think this is one where the pop stars can be an interesting conduit of getting that news out. And then Trump, of course, has actually made it worse by, refusing to back down and trying to talk around, oh, I don't know who that guy is. I didn't hear it, his usual stuff. So I think they could have denatured it really quickly, and they didn't.
The foreign minister of Malaysia took to social media to respond to the ex-Fox News talk show host Tucker Carlson, who mistakenly identified U.S. presidential candidate Kamala Harris as Samoan Malaysian, I think was his characterization.
I mean, it's blatant. It's using people's nationalities and ethnicity as a punchline. Like, you couldn't possibly have a Samoan you couldn't possibly have a Malaysian, like just pulling these names out of a hat and using them so contemptuously. It's just complete textbook racism. And, this whole idea that white people like Tucker Carlson are being victimized in this world is just so preposterous.
It's really been a pleasure talking to you. And thanks for your insight.
Yeah, I empathize with everyone who's confused, because we all are.
Let's now go a little deeper on the contenders here to truly size up what they're offering to the American people. Donald Trump's big idea for the U.S. is making America great again. Again. In his eyes, the way to get there is through slashing taxes, ramping up border security, reinvigorating the hollowed-out manufacturing base, judiciously slapping tariffs on imports, and possibly empowering the armed forces to restore law and order, while also ending what he calls the weaponization of government against the American people.
He's Hitler! And then they say, he's a Nazi. I'm not a Nazi.
Trump is also promising to create an Iron Dome missile defense system for the U.S. that would cost trillions of dollars. He wants to rid the military of woke generals. And on day one, he wants to begin the largest deportation operation in American history. He's even joked about being a dictator, but just for a day.
He says, you're not going to be a dictator, are you? I said, no, other than day one. We're closing the border.
Opposing Trump is Kamala Harris. The Democratic Party's candidate is looking to succeed the administration of Joe Biden and continue the platform she helped build as vice president. Her campaign has not sought to revolutionize the U.S. through radical policy, but electing the first woman to the Oval Office would be history in its own right. Instead, Harris is sticking close to the party line.
Would you have done something differently than President Biden during the past 4 years?
There is not a thing that comes to mind.
The Harris presidency may bring subtle policy differences. She has historically been less hawkish about defending Israel, and many of her climate pledges tend to aim higher. But most Americans voting for Harris will be doing so under the impression they're getting more of the same, if in the form of a very different and considerably younger person.
Joe Biden's legacy of accomplishment over the past 3 years is unmatched in modern history.
Thrust suddenly into the role of nominee, Harris has worked hard, not only to gain the trust of Democratic supporters, but also to reach across the aisle, hoping the chaos of Trump's first term was enough to steer them away from electing him to another one.
As thousands of supporters of President Trump stormed the U.S. Capitol building, venting their anger at the victory of Joe Biden.
On the face of it, the election seems straightforward. If you're an American who's all right with how the country's gone since 2020, then you're probably voting for Harris. If you want to return to the past or a very different future than what Harris is promising, you're siding with Trump. But going back to the past is never as simple as it seems. You may be an American who thinks Trump is your ticket back to the economic security you felt in 2018. But you may also want women to have a constitutionally protected right to abortion. Or you might be a Puerto Rican Republican who just had to endure racist mockery from an insult comic hired for a gig at a Trump rally.
There's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah, I think it's called Puerto Rico.
Case for Kamala Harris may not be as clear-cut either. During the Biden-Harris administration, Israel has unleashed carnage in Gaza, killing an estimated 43,000 Palestinians and counting since the brutal Hamas terror attack of October 7, 2023. As the death toll has climbed and ceasefire efforts have failed, the U.S. has remained steadfast in protecting its ally Israel and leader Benjamin Netanyahu, even in the face of charges of war crimes and genocide. As in countries around the world, the American public is sharply divided in its sympathies, and that includes Democratic voters, which poses a real challenge for Harris, who needs to keep them all on board. Harris has also been deferential in her defense of transgender people, despite an outsized attack from the Trump campaign.
I believe that people, as the law states, that is a decision that doctors will make in terms of what is medically necessary.
But the one issue Harris has consistently and compassionately campaigned on is abortion rights, railing against the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, the 1973 court decision that effectively legalized abortion across the U.S. Harris says she will urge Congress to protect national abortion rights for women.
I will fight to restore what Donald Trump and his hand-selected Supreme Court justices took away from the women of America.
Trump has been anything but consistent on the issue. He is claimed to be the most pro-life candidate in history, and also said that some abortion laws are too tough and in need of reform. It seems most likely that a Trump administration would leave abortion laws up to the discretion of the states. That means in 13 states, including Texas, Oklahoma, Idaho, and Indiana, abortion is completely illegal, while a further 12 are classified as hostile by the Center for Reproductive Rights, a legal advocacy group.
Project 2025 is an exhaustive and very lengthy plan to restrict individual rights. For reproductive rights, it demonstrates that a hostile new federal administration could take actions through federal agencies against not just only abortion, but also against contraceptive and assisted reproductive care.
And it was, of course, Trump who appointed 3 justices to the Supreme Court during his first term. This set the stage for the rollback of Roe v. Wade.
There is no longer a federal constitutional right to an abortion.
Another major battleground has been immigration. Trump has been unrelenting and railing against so-called open borders and the migrant invasion.
On day one, I will launch the largest deportation program in American history to get the criminals out.
Harris has struggled to match the rhetoric of the Republicans without alienating her supporters. Harris, who prosecuted drug smugglers when she served as California's Attorney General, played a key role in border security under the Biden administration. Throughout her term as vice president, she consistently discouraged people from trying to come to the U.S.
To folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek, do not come.
Trump's deportation plan invokes dormant legislation originally from 1798. In 2024, Trump has indicated the law would first and foremost target drug traffickers. But in the same breath, Trump and his vice presidential running mate, J.D. Vance, have set an initial target of 1 million deportations.
The message from the Trump administration is simple. Pack your bags because in 4 months, you're going home. We do not consent to an invasion of this country for millions of people who shouldn't be here.
This would be the biggest deportation exercise since the Eisenhower era. It could cost hundreds of billions. It would destroy communities and tank the U.S. economy. People who have lived in the U.S. for decades could possibly be deported.
You put one wrong person onto a bus or onto an airplane, and your radical left lunatics will try and make it sound like the worst thing that's ever happened.
We'll be right back.
Hi, my name is Andrew Jaspin, and I'm the founding editor and director of 360 Info. At 360 Info, we're providing evidence-driven, solution-based journalism, all written by leading experts. Every week, we release new and innovative news content that bridges the gap between the world's brightest minds and the global public. To be part of the fight against misinformation, sign up for our newsletters and follow us on social media, or head to 360info.org. If you're a journalist or a publisher or editor, you can sign up for our Newswire service, which is free of charge at newshub.360info.org.
Strangely enough, one of Trump's strongest public allies in this campaign is himself an immigrant.
Hi, everyone. As you can see, I'm not just MAGA, I'm dark MAGA.
South African-born billionaire Elon Musk has thrown his full support behind Trump, amplifying Republican messaging to his 202 million followers on X, the social media platform Musk bought 2 years ago. He has also donated millions of dollars to Trump's campaign.
Elon Musk! I'm not just MAGA, I'm dark, gothic MAGA.
So what does Musk want for his money? Elon Musk has called for trade barriers against Chinese electric vehicles to protect U.S. companies, like the leading electric car company Tesla, where he serves as CEO and is the largest shareholder. Musk claims to be a free speech absolutist, and just so happens to call for less regulation on platforms like his social media app X. He's now expected in a courtroom to answer questions from a judge over why he's offering voters in battleground states $1 million checks.
Billionaire Elon Musk promised to give away $1 million each day until November's election to someone who signs his online petition pledging support for the First and Second Amendments.
On the economic agenda, Harris wants to stimulate the economy by raising the corporate tax rate and extending taxes on the top 1%. She's promising tax cuts to 100 million Americans, mostly targeting the middle class. And the Harris campaign aims to implement laws to combat price gouging on food and groceries, nationalizing policy already in place in 37 states. What makes a Highwire Act so captivating is the implicit chance you're about to see a horrifying disaster. Trump claims that the U.S. economy is doing poorly, but the facts say that's not the case. Since 2002, when the world was hit by COVID-related and global instability-linked inflation, the U.S. economy has added a record 17 million jobs. Household incomes are climbing, yet the dominant narrative is one of decline.
We are a nation in decline. We are a failed nation.
And Trump can rely on one major topic. Harris cannot. He is not currently in power. Trump's wild card is that Biden and Harris were forced to clean up a series of messes that the former president himself helped to create. Many exist outside the U.S. Trump's fueling of the ethno-nationalist rulers of Russia, Israel, along with others, across the globe, have helped nurture instability.
Comfortable with them stopping. We should have a ceasefire now. Now I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin.
While Trump can't be blamed for the harms of the world since he lost power in 2020, Biden, and as a result Harris, can, and it's weighing on the way people are likely to vote. To get more, let's bring in Dr. James Dorsey. He's an adjunct senior fellow at Singapore's Nanyang Technological University and the author of the syndicated column and podcast, The Turbulent World, with James M. Dorsey. So, speaking with James Dorsey about what's happening, what's at stake, the simple question would be, what's at stake in the Middle East right now?
Let's be clear. With the exception of specific communities within the United States, foreign policy as such, and the Middle East in particular, is not a major election issue. It never has been, and it's not this time. Even if it is magnified by what's happening in the Middle East and the pictures that we see every day on our screens, and it's magnified by the numbers in the United States. And what I mean by the numbers in the United States is this is going to, by the looks of it, be a very hard-fought election in which for both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, each vote counts. In, for example, Michigan, you have a larger concentration of Arab and Muslim voters, American Muslim, American Arab voters, who care much far deeper about what's happening in the Middle East. And you have a significant community there that has or was non-committed in the vote. We saw, I think, surprisingly and mistakenly in the last few days, some Muslim leaders rally around Donald Trump. Now, to be fair, from a Muslim or Arab point of view, neither Trump nor Kamala Harris is really palatable. But if you have to make choices between bad alternatives or bad options, in my mind, it's very clear what the bad option, what the better of the bad options is, or the less worse option, if you wish. We don't know what Kamala Harris' position is. Kamala Harris has an advantage and she has a disadvantage. Unlike an incumbent president or a Democratic Party candidate who is not in an administration, she's vice president of the Biden administration. She cannot afford to distance herself if she wanted to. We don't know if she wanted to, from the administration prior to the election. Now, she's sort of hinted at being more critical of Israel. She's hinted at being more empathetic than Biden towards the Palestinians. But that's as far as she has gone, and that's probably as far as she could go. I think we're only going to know come November 6th. So if Kamala Harris wins that election, that is the moment that we're going to know more. But on the other hand, we know who Donald Trump is. Donald Trump is the president who, in his presidency, sold the Palestinians down the drain. He basically defunded UNRWA. He closed the Palestine Authority office in Washington. He endorsed the annexation of Jerusalem, of East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. He basically turned the Palestinian issue into an economic issue and increasing economic welfare rather than looking for a solution that is equitable to both Palestinians and Israelis. So I think that those Palestinian leaders that in protest against Kamala Harris are going to find that they've really been the frog jumping from the hot water into the frying pan.
A few things that you point out there I want to explore a bit more. On that last point about, as you put it, Trump selling the Palestinians, selling them out. And I was thinking about really the Afghanistan scenario also and what Trump set up that the Biden administration basically walked into. And that I think doesn't get very much play. I wonder if that also sets a model for the way that Trump is going to deal with conflict situations, resolving intractable problems with bad solutions.
First of all, let's keep in mind, part of Trump's base are Christian Zionists who are pro-Israel. And that's who he's catering to, among other things. Now, clearly, he's going to be more susceptible to what his base wants, much like he was in the first administration. So that's, I think, one side of Trump. The other side of Trump is that you have a commonality, if you wish, between Trump and Netanyahu that goes beyond the fact that Trump is, in his first presidency has given Netanyahu what he wanted. These are men who have political affinity. They are part of what I would call a critical mass of world leaders who think in civilizational terms rather than in national terms.
Can you just elaborate on what you said about acting on civilizational terms? I think that's really important.
So these civilizational terms mean different things, but they all fit a pattern. Some of what I would call civilizational leaders, ethno-nationalist leaders, whether that's a definition of a group in civilizational terms on the basis of religious or cultural issues, or whether it's based on ethnic issues. But then you have civilizational leaders for whom it is much more about territorial expansion. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China's incursions on territory of others, literal states on the Chinese Sea, Vladimir Putin's definition of the Russian world, and the borders of the Russian world, which essentially is anywhere that there is some group of Russian speakers or people who adhere to Russian culture. And then you have Donald Trump, who basically would prefer Norwegian immigrants. You just have to look at the last rally in Madison Square Garden, where it not necessarily was what Trump said, but these are the people he wanted to participate in his rally, and he has not distanced himself from them ever since. Now, there's one interesting recent development, which is that the far right has been pro-Israel, but you've just seen Giorgia Meloni, the far right prime minister of Italy, announcing a weapons embargo against Israel. You just saw the Alternative für Deutschland, the Alternative for Germany, the far right party call for a weapons suspension of weapons sales to Israel. So in some ways, drawing a much bigger picture, if you wish, what you're seeing is a fragmenting of what is Israel's international support network, both in terms of Western leaders, including the far right, not all of the far right, some of the far right, but nonetheless, but also in terms of conservative Arab states.
It's certainly well established that Americans tend not to vote for the most part on foreign policy issues. But at the same time, there is a narrative about the forever wars that's very much a part of the sort of Trumpist dialogue. I wonder if foreign policy does have a kind of idealized role in what his administration, his presidency would do.
Well, let me separate the issues. One, the forever wars. The United States at the moment is not at war in the Middle East. So the forever wars were a Trump argument that resonated when you had massive numbers of American troops in combat. That's no longer the case. There are analysts who believe that Netanyahu was willing to be restrained for the moment with Iran, waiting for Trump to win the election, and then he will have a free hand to do what he wants. Fact of the matter is, Trump prides himself on not having started a war in his presidency. So I'm not sure that the forever wars is what's going to resonate at this moment. The issue of arms sales, first of all, you've got one sale suspended, and you've had it suspended for months, and those were, if I'm not incorrect, 5,000-pound bombs. You now have a letter by the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State saying, if you do not improve humanitarian aid into Gaza within 30 days, we will consider suspending arms. Then you have, on top of that, you've got what's going on at this very minute, the siege in northern Gaza and Jabalia, where aid has been cut off for the last 3 weeks. And you have the passing of 2 laws in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, that essentially bans UNRWA, the United Nations agency, from operating in Israel or Israeli-controlled territories, which effectively means the West Bank and Gaza. That is the primary humanitarian agency capable of distributing aid. So the Israelis, Netanyahu, basically is pushing an agenda here that may suddenly make arms embargoes or suspension of arms or some form of real pressure no longer avoidable for the administration if it wants to be seen to be complying not only with international law, but with U.S. law and with the policies it's laid down.
I want to thank you again for your time.
My pleasure.
And your insights. It's really really fascinating to hear. That's it for this episode of Leave It to the Experts. For more on the U.S. election and analysis from some of the world's leading experts, head to 360info.org. You can sign up for our newsletters and newswire for journalists and understand our work to fight against misinformation with university experts worldwide. This episode of Leave It to the Experts was produced by Michael Joyner, Reese Hooker, and Lachlan Guselli. Music by Yarn Skubishevsky, Redmen Studios. I'm Sam Hendricks. See you next time.